convoy is reportedly begging for help from allies as Iran appears to gain the upper hand in the Strait of Hormuz.
Iranians were also able to shoot down another aircraft over the Gulf.
Rooting against our troops in the success of their mission.
Iranian coast east of Hormuz 2:17 AM 36 Rangers. 4 target structures. Estimated 22 hostile personnel. Objective: recover launch records, encrypted drives, and 1 high-value facilitator. The village looked asleep from a distance, but nothing about it was peaceful. 4 low concrete structures sat behind chest-high walls and rusted steel gates, arranged around a packed dirt yard where tire ruts cut through salt dust and old oil stains. A dead generator crouched beside the largest building like an animal with its throat cut, and a strand of broken bulbs hung across the courtyard, dark for now. 2 lookout points overlooked the outer approach, one facing the road from the coast, the other facing the dry slope behind the compound. Intelligence suggested the site had served as a temporary coordination point, a place where missile launch confirmation, movement orders, and payment records had been gathered after the strike in the Strait. Night had been chosen for one reason above all others. The men inside believed darkness belonged to them. At 2:17, the coast itself seemed to disappear. The water beyond the black shoreline was invisible, the sky a lid of cloud that erased moonlight and horizon alike. Through green glow optics, the village sharpened into a world of edges and heat signatures, wall lines, door frames, motion in windows, the faint breath of men who thought shadows hid them. The Rangers moved as if the night had opened just enough to let them through. No engines, no shouted orders, no warning. Only shapes crossing deeper shapes, closing the distance while the village slept under the false protection of its own darkness. This was not a battle announced by thunder. It began like pressure building behind a sealed door. Men at the edge of the settlement shifted on watch without understanding that they had already been seen, counted, and measured. A rooftop silhouette turned his head toward the road and looked straight through the darkness where the assault force waited, never knowing he had just stared at the thing that would unmake his world. The village was quiet in the way a room is quiet 1 second before glass breaks. And then the night started moving. At 2:19, Overwatch confirmed the pattern one final time. 1 heat source in the north shack. 4 clustered in the generator room annex. 6 in the main structure, 2 of them still awake. 3 in the eastern outbuilding. Movement in a rear linter that had not appeared in the earlier brief. The problem with night raids is not darkness itself. It is what darkness gives to the complacent. Inside the compound, the men guarding the aftermath of the missile attack believed distance, walls, and religion had wrapped them in safety. Outside the walls, the Rangers had already reduced the place to sectors, intervals, routes, doors, bodies, and time. Minutes into the operation, the assault element reached the outer wall. What the Rangers saw was not blackness but texture. Cinder block seams, broken mortar, peeling paint, the lean of warped metal doors, the pale wash of old heat trapped in rooftops. What the defenders saw was nothing. One guard paused beside the courtyard and raised a hand to scratch his beard, rifle hanging loose on his shoulder. Another leaned back against a parapet on the far side and stared into the open desert, listening to a world that no longer belonged to him. The Rangers were already at the wall before the first man inside understood there was anything to fear. At 2:21, the compound was entered from multiple sides in the same breath. One door went inward under sudden force. Another opened on a hinge with scarcely a sound. The yard that had felt like the center of a hidden network turned, in a single instant, into a trap. The first defenders were overwhelmed before they could process what was happening, blinded not by daylight but by confusion, by the violence of movement arriving out of total darkness. Somewhere a metal cup hit concrete and spun. Somewhere else a chair tipped over backward. The raid did not begin with chaos. It began with precision so fast it only looked like chaos to the men on the receiving end. At 2:22, the first room in the main building was secured. Sleeping mats, stacked crates, cheap radios, a map pinned crooked to the wall. A man reached for something beneath a blanket and was stopped before he could bring it clear. Another stumbled up from the floor, disoriented, hands high, mouth working soundlessly in the dark. Beyond that first room was a narrow corridor and 2 side chambers, both occupied, both entered in seconds. Every doorway was a threshold between ignorance and revelation. Every second denied the defenders the one thing they needed most: time to understand. 5 minutes into the raid, the eastern building proved worse than expected. It had been assessed as storage. It was not storage. It held additional fighters crowded around communication gear and sealed transit cases, men who had remained awake long after the rest of the village bedded down. When the breach came, one of them lunged for the radio table, another for a long weapon propped in the corner, another simply froze as if his mind had rejected what his eyes were telling him. The room turned violent in a heartbeat, short and brutal, the noise of close struggle snapping through the compound like boards breaking. Outside, the night remained enormous and indifferent. Inside, the hidden building became the most dangerous place in the village for less than a minute. At 2:24, the first complication hit. The generator came alive. Not all at once. First a cough. Then a grinding churn. Then the compound exploded with raw yellow light as flood lamps kicked on over the yard and a string of bulbs blazed awake across the wire. After so much black, it felt obscene. Shadows spun across walls. Dust flared gold in the air. The defenders who were still moving suddenly thought the light might save them, that illumination would reveal the attackers and restore the world to something understandable. Instead it did the opposite. The lights exposed every open doorway,
the generators
every panic face,
the outer
every
village
bad
awake.
decision. Doors opened
Men who had
beyond
hidden
the
in darkness
darkness
now stood naked in their own
voices
courtyard
carried
while
over
the
rangers,
walls.
already
A
inside the
motorcycle
geometry of the
coughed somewhere
compound,
down the road and
adapted
then died.
instantly and kept
A
driving.
dog
Started barking and would not stop. At 2:25, movement appeared from an adjacent structure outside the primary objective, then from a roofline farther east, then from the alley leading to the coast road. The defenders had assumed any threat would come from the sea or from the road in broad daylight. They had not prepared for disciplined violence arriving between breaths. What little warning the lights gave them only accelerated their collapse. At 2:26, the second complication surfaced inside the rear annex. The high-value individual was there, but not alone, and not free. He had been bound to a steel chair in a cramped utility room behind stacked fuel cans and tool chests, with wire running along the floor toward the doorframe in a crude attempt to turn panic into a last resort. The room smelled like diesel and scorched insulation. Whoever had rigged it had done so in haste, but haste was enough to kill if someone rushed blind into it. The Rangers halted, reassessed, and shifted from violence to control in an instant, reading the room, tracing the danger, isolating the prisoner, refusing to let desperation dictate the outcome. In night operations, dominance is not just speed. It is the ability to slow down at exactly the right second. At 2:28, the prisoner was secured alive. He had a split lip, wrists torn from restraints, and the wild, unbelieving eyes of a man who thought the dark had become a tomb. When he was pulled free, he resisted at first, not because he wanted to stay, but because terror had stripped meaning from everything around him. To him, every armed silhouette was just another captor until reality forced its way through the shock. Behind him, the room where he had been held yielded more than a hostage. There were notebooks wrapped in plastic, handheld storage devices sealed in tape, 2 hardened cases stamped with shipping marks, and a wall calendar carrying dates that mattered far beyond that village. The raid had started as retaliation through intelligence. It was becoming something larger. At 2:29, the main structure produced the first hard confirmation. Beneath a trapdoor under carpet stained with tea and engine grease, the Rangers found a buried compartment lined with ammunition tins and commercial packing foam. Inside were drives, ledgers, coded call sheets, satellite phone batteries, and printouts showing maritime tracks in the Strait. Some pages were damp at the edges. Some had been burned and smothered before destruction could finish its work. The men inside had known the risk of keeping records. They had kept them anyway because success breeds arrogance, and arrogance leaves paper trails. 12 minutes into the raid, resistance shifted outward. Small arms fire cracked from a neighboring rooftop outside the primary compound, wild and rushed, aimed more at fear than at targets. Glass blew inward from one of the upper windows. Dust kicked off the courtyard wall in sudden puffs. The defenders were no longer trying to protect the site. They were trying to survive the revelation that the war they thought they had launched at sea had followed them home to the middle of the night. The Rangers did not chase noise into the dark. They controlled angles, returned decisive fire where necessary, and kept the center of gravity where it belonged: the intelligence, the prisoner, the clock. At 2:31, time became the loudest thing in the compound. Every room cleared, every case lifted, every detainee secured was measured against dawn. The village was now fully awake beyond the walls. Distant engines could be heard starting and stopping, perhaps locals, perhaps reinforcements, perhaps frightened men debating whether courage was worth dying for tonight. Overhead, the sky remained low and starless. The sea stayed invisible. The only light came from the generator and the harsh lamps it fed, turning the courtyard into an exposed stage where fear had nowhere left to hide. A quarter hour into the raid, the Rangers moved through the final structure, a squat building on the compound's western edge that had been treated as secondary. Inside were more weapons than the initial picture suggested, some wrapped in blankets against salt air, others stacked as if only briefly set down before being moved again. Tubes, crates, guidance components, commercial drones modified past innocence, and documents linking names to payments and payments to ports. The village was not just a hideout. It was a relay point, a place where strike materials and strike evidence crossed paths under the assumption no one would ever arrive fast enough to seize both. That assumption died in that room at T234. Another burst of fire came from outside the wall, closer now. A pickup truck rolled into the lane east of the compound and braked hard, its headlights bouncing against mud, brick and concrete. Men spilled from the bed with the confused urgency of those who had expected to ride toward victory and instead found themselves charging into someone else's kill zone. They shouted over one another. One fired before the truck had fully stopped. Another tried to swing wide toward a gap in the wall and disappeared from sight. For the men arriving late, the scene made no sense. Lights blazing, doors open, bodies down, prisoners bound, unseen shooters answering movement with immediate consequence. They had come to reinforce certainty. They arrived at a nightmare at AT-235. The blocking force outside the target area stopped the momentum cold. The reinforcements never built an attack. They unraveled into fragments under disciplined pressure and the total collapse of their own situational awareness. Some tried to retreat the way they had come. Some dropped flat in the road, firing without aim. Some fled between buildings toward the shoreline, where darkness offered only the illusion of escape. The raiders, because that is what rangers become in the mind of the enemy once they appear from nowhere, strike everywhere, and vanish before dawn, did not need spectacle. They needed the lane closed, the perimeter held, and the exfil route preserved. That was enough. At 2:37, the detainees were consolidated in the courtyard. One stared fixedly at the ground. Another mumbled a prayer that never found rhythm. A third kept glancing toward the dead generator even though it now ran loudly beside him, as if his mind still lived in the moment before the lights came on. The prisoner recovered from the annex sat wrapped in a blanket, breathing in sharp bursts, listening to foreign voices that had become the difference between life and death. Around him, the rangers moved with the stripped-down economy of men who had rehearsed harder than others had dreamed. No wasted words. No wasted motion. No wasted pity for the men who had hidden the machinery of attack among sleeping families and concrete walls. At 2:39, the intelligence hall was packaged for movement. Laptops, drives, ledger books, satellite components, marked maps, handwritten serial references, a sealed pouch containing memory cards taped beneath a drawer, another hidden behind loose masonry in the generator room, a phone half smashed under boot, still warm. The story of the missile launch was no longer rumor stitched from radar tracks and political accusation. It was becoming physical evidence, piece by piece, carried out by men who had entered unseen and would leave before the first honest light touched the compound walls. 23 minutes into the raid, the emotional temperature of the village began to change. The first minutes had been panic, then shock, then resistance. Now came something colder, recognition. Doors in the surrounding lanes stopped opening. Faces vanished from windows. The men who had believed the night protected them began to understand the opposite truth. That night had delivered judgment to their threshold and shown them how little their walls meant. The darkness they had relied on for concealment had become the medium through which they were exposed. They had trusted night as cover. The rangers used it as territory. At 2:41, a small fire started in the eastern building where scattered fuel had ignited amid the violence of entry and struggle. Smoke rolled thick and low through the doorway, catching the generator light in greasy bands. It would have been easy to let the place burn hot and bury whatever remained. But intelligence does not forgive laziness. Critical material was stripped out before flame could take it. The rest was left to smolder in the corner of a room where men had once believed they were safely hidden from consequence. Even fire, tonight, was denied the final word. At 2:43, exfiltration began. The prisoners were moved first, then the evidence, then the assault elements peeled away from the compound in a sequence that seemed almost impossible given the violence that had filled the previous half hour. One moment the place was packed with motion and command. The next it was being emptied with ruthless efficiency. The generator still hammered. The lights still burned. A chair lay broken in the courtyard. A doorway hung off one hinge. The village around it remained awake but unwilling to challenge the dark a second time. Too many had seen what came out of it. At 2:45, the last rangers cleared the outer wall. Behind them, the compound stayed lit like a warning set in concrete. The sea wind pushed smoke low across the dirt lane. Somewhere a muezzin would call hours later to a dawn that would reveal everything left behind. Spent casings, shattered radios, blood on the threshold, ledgers gone, prisoner gone, certainty gone. But at that moment the night still ruled, and the force that had mastered it was already withdrawing into terrain the defenders could not read. The operation had lasted less than half an hour. For the men inside the compound, it would divide life into before and after. At 2:48, distant engines marked the first serious response, moving too late to matter. The Rangers were already beyond the village, breaking contact on their own timeline, carrying a human source, multiple detainees, and the documentary spine of the strike network that had believed it could lash out at an aircraft carrier and disappear into the folds of the coast. The night swallowed the assault force the same way it had revealed it, completely, mercilessly, on its own terms. To those arriving after, There would be only aftermath and rumor. Men would point to the walls, the roof, the burned room, the empty compartment beneath the carpet, and speak as if something supernatural had crossed the village. In a way, to them, it had. By the time the horizon began hinting at dawn far beyond Hormuz, the raid was over in every way that mattered. The hidden records were no longer hidden. The facilitator was no longer protected. The men who had treated the village like a sanctuary had learned that darkness can betray as easily as its shields. They had mistaken the absence of light for the absence of reach. That is a fatal misunderstanding against an enemy trained to turn the night itself into an advantage. They felt safest when the village went black, when the generator died and the coast disappeared and every road into the hamlet became just another ribbon of darkness. They thought that meant invisibility. They thought walls and shadows and distance would confuse whoever came for them. But night is not neutral. In the hands of disciplined men, it becomes reach, surprise, and decision. The defenders hid in darkness. The rangers used it like a blade.